G'day students. So I'm going to put together two videos for today's lesson. So the first one is just going to go through the practice sack that I gave you over a week ago. I was going to spend one lesson on that, and I think that leaving it till Thursday is a bit too late. So put together a video here of just my suggested responses, and I'll talk through what I mean because I haven't written out full responses. I've just given guides of where the marks are coming from. So we'll go through that first, and then the second video will be the new content for Unit 4, which is all around the fitness components, that agreed model that exists around how we categorize fitness for different athletes and for all human beings. So I'll go through each of those ones in the second video. Okay, so here's the answer guide for that practice sack. Following activity where the greatest oxygen deficit would be C, the 400-meter sprint. Because of the intensity of the 3.5 minutes and the 40-minute jog, they don't go through as much oxygen deficit, bringing the VO2 to as high of a level because they stay in steady state for longer. So the fact that it's 45 seconds of maximal intensity work would have the greatest contribution from the anaerobic systems and therefore the largest oxygen deficit. Question 2, the most likely predominant energy system for the 100-meter sprint. Obviously, we know that we have anaerobic glycolysis kicking in as I shouldn't say kicking in, increasing its contributions as we continue through the 100-meter sprint, but ATP-PC energy system will provide energy for the majority of that event, so it is the predominant energy system. Question 3, during the marathon, the major cause of fatigue. Now, each of these things will deplete. However, the liver glycogen will continue to restore through gluconeogenesis. The blood glucose and the plasma glucose is the same thing. And as we continue to increase our amount of glycogen in the liver, that it's going to be transported as glucose in the blood and the plasma. So therefore, what we're going to end up having is a relatively consistent level of that. And then we've got our depletion of muscle glycogen. So as we continue for 3 hours, we're burning away at that glycogen, so it will begin to deplete. The Hawaii Triathlon, obviously because of the thermoregulation, which we'll talk about again later on in this sack, all of the above. So as we sweat, we lose plasma levels, the body temperature is elevated, and we lose electrolytes. So all of the above. Next one there, if you've got somebody who's running at 60% max heart rate compared to 75% max heart rate. Now, we had issues last year with this question on the SAC. I believe we ended up accepting both A and D as acceptable responses. However, if you look at it, I believe that A is probably the nicest answer because both of these 60% and 75% max heart rate activities running will be aerobically dominant, but when you are training or running at a lower intensity, it's just running at a slower rate. So you've actually got less a slower contribution. I shouldn't use the word rate. So I think A is the better answer, but I believe D would be nice and correct as well. Performing a cool down at conclusion of an intense training session. Obviously, we're just going to extend EPOC, so B is the correct answer there. EPOC, which is that excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, also known as oxygen debt and paying back it, can be increased by performing an active recovery. Now, a couple of people wanted to choose all of the above because they thought the typo was for DOMS instead of TOMS. Now that is a typo. However, one thing that you need to understand is that the word assist in part A is actually incorrect because assist means to help out with. We actually remove the ability of the venous pooling. So it prevents venous pooling. It doesn't assist it. By saying that it assists venous pooling, what that's saying is that's actually saying that more blood will pool in the veins by doing the active recovery. So it's definitely not A, which means it can't be all of the above. And with TOMS as the typo, we go with B as the correct response there. Question 8, glycogen restoration. Obviously, active recovery passive recovery, neither of those are actually helping replenish. While you are consuming the high GI foods, you are going to want to be having a passive recovery at the same time. However, that doesn't actually restore the glycogen. So C is the correct answer. I saw a couple of people who handed me their practice SACs having trouble with this one. But if we're delaying the buildup of metabolic byproducts, then we actually want to be working at or below our lactate inflection point. Now, for most people, that would be working at 70 to 75%. But I say most people because some very unfit, untrained people working at 70 to 75% of their max will be working above lactate inflection point. So D is the correct answer there. And then finally, the biggest limiting factor for the ATP PC system, we obviously don't have any glycogen involved in that system. There's no hydrogen ion, so it's either A or B. Yes, we do build up some inorganic phosphates, but depleting creatine phosphate is the biggest limiting factor. Okay, so this table should have been relatively straightforward for most people to fill in. You get 1 mark for getting a correct answer in these 3 boxes and 2 marks per box for these ones here. Just have a read of this keyword here. What is the effect on the predominant energy system? So if we said something like loss of creatine phosphate or depletion of creatine phosphate or something like that, then you need to actually say that because we are losing creatine phosphate stores, the body will not be able to use the ATP-PC energy system as much, and therefore we have to use anaerobic energy system, which is slower. So that's the sort of level of detail on the effect box that you need to write about. Be careful with that 400 meter one because it's the hydrogen ions that's a critical bit when you're saying build up of metabolic byproducts, not the lactate. So try and make sure that you're being really specific with your answers. And then finally, there are a couple of answers that were going to be acceptable for the marathon, the 42 kilometer. Thermoregulation and dehydration is one that's a very, very good answer, but also depletion of muscle glycogen or glycogen as a fuel was a good enough answer. And make sure that your effect matched whichever one you chose for that one there. Moving on to the swimming question. Now, I remember that in 2020, this was a poorly answered question. Students really struggled to understand that the graph itself, each of the lines was different intensity. So one intensity was completing a 50-meter lap in 60 seconds. The next one was 50-meter lap in 50 seconds, so quicker. So it makes sense that there is a higher lactate level. 40 seconds per 50 meter, it's a higher lactate level. 38 seconds per 50 meter, and we can see lactate inflection point has been hit. It also says that the first 15 minutes were part of the warm-up for the main training bout. So it's not really until this 15-minute mark where we watch what's actually happening. So during the main session, aerobic energy system for 3 out of the 4 trials, and therefore overall that's the predominant energy system is aerobic glycolysis system. Please don't just write aerobic. These are my quick notes. By referring to the graph, justify your answer. You must refer to the graph, which means you have to mention one of these lines and the intensity of those lines. And you want to be talking about the fact that the 40-second, 50-second, and 60-second per 50 meter are all steady state because their line is nice and flat. So those are the sorts of things that you want to be writing in that one for 2 marks. If you don't justify your answer by referring to the graph and mentioning the numbers and talking about the shape of the graph, you wouldn't get full marks. Why would you consider the 38 seconds per 50 meter not sustained as long as the others? It's because you're working above the lactate inflection point, not enough oxygen, therefore it's anaerobically dominant, and there'll be a buildup of metabolic byproducts during that energy system, which means that you can't sustain that for long periods of time. If you wanted to talk about muscle acidosis, you can. It's up to you about that 3rd mark, depending on where you start. I think 1 mark for mentioning that you're working above the lactate inflection point, another mark for mentioning what that means, the fact that there's not enough oxygen to work aerobically, and then the final mark meaning the buildup of metabolic byproducts and slowing us down. Next one here, based on the data provided, when do you believe the swimmer goes above their lactate inflection point? Slightly misleading because we've got 40 seconds is steady state, 38 seconds is lactate inflection, clearly. The question is, what about 39 seconds per 50 meters? So I said in my answer that either 39 or, sorry, that's an 8, not a 36, 39 or 38 seconds, and ensure that I'm referring to my graph. I would talk about the shape of the graph and the fact that the other graphs are able to stay flat after the first 15-minute warm-up. This one is not able to, and it's because of a build-up in that lactate due to the fact that we're working anaerobically at that point. Okay, moving on to the next one here. After the initial warm-up of the 3 swimming speeds, lactate levels off. Briefly discuss why. You needed to mention the word steady state, and you also need to mention the fact that it's the body's acute responses that are taking time to kick in, and as the body is trying to get its cardiovascular and respiratory system to deliver enough oxygen to the working muscles, it takes time for that to occur. That's your 2 marks there. Okay, I think that there's a clear 5 marks for this 5-mark interplay question. First mark for all 3 energy systems are always contributing to ATP resynthesis. And then each mark comes from step 2, 3, 4, and 5. Obviously, you could lose marks by using words like kicks in or then this energy system begins and things like that, which we've spoken in detail about. So make sure your language use is correct. But essentially, in dot point 2, we are running at a constant speed for 2 kilometers. For most people, that would be 10 minutes plus. So therefore, due to the distance and time, they are aerobically glycolysis dominant. For dot point 3, it says rapid walking. A couple of students have handed me their practice SAC and said that that was anaerobic. Any type of walking is going to be aerobic. It doesn't matter how vigorous you make that walk, it is still a walk. We're only talking anaerobic when we end up getting into that sort of sprint section and explosiveness. So I'm not sure where we get that idea from, but rapid walking and the fact that it's 5 minutes means that we are definitely working aerobically for dot point 3. For dot point 4, we're doing sprints. Obviously, the word sprint means high intensity, so therefore we're working anaerobically, and this is the point where we can talk about the start of it will be ATP-PC dominant, but you'll have to move into anaerobic because there is easy running in between each sprint, and therefore you're not having enough time to replenish phosphate creatine stores each time. And you could even mention the fact that phosphate creatine will replenish best during passive recovery, and this is an active movement. And finally, dot point 5 is back to that walking. They're trying to trick you by saying it's rapid, and they're trying to trick you by saying it's uphill. What you want to say here is that it's aerobically dominant, but you also want to mention that there would be an increased contribution from the anaerobic systems to try and overcome the uphill factor. But essentially, the overall training is aerobically dominant. All right, on this next one, we're looking at a cool down, and they say that an active recovery is performed. Now, when you talk about an active recovery, I want you to split the idea of lactic acid in your head into the 2 parts. So lactate and hydrogen ions. So an active recovery is going to do 2 things. Firstly, with the cardiovascular system, the heart, blood, and blood vessels, we're actually moving a lot of blood around the body. So the fact that we're moving that blood around the body for a longer period of time, we're going to be able to shuttle the lactate over to the liver to try and ensure that we can do the gluconeogenesis and actually make more glycogen within the body. The other part of it is the respiratory system, and that is the fact that we're breathing continuously higher rates and we're bringing in more oxygen. When that takes place, we're able to oxidize hydrogen ions. So the oxygen is able to be taken down to the muscle, and we're able to turn those hydrogen ions into water, H2O. Moving on to the next question, 2 dietary recovery strategies. I know Mr. Smith and I talked a lot last year about whether we accepted hydration as a dietary recovery strategy and argued the point backwards and forwards. Essentially, the best two answers here are the fact that we've got high GI replacement to replenish the glycogen that's been lost as quickly as possible. And so mentioning it up above and then talking about why that's important and what it means down below earns you 2 marks. The other one that was a really important one to mention was protein. Now, don't forget that with protein, you've got 2 factors. Firstly, you've got the fact that it will repair damages to the muscle and tears in the muscle. But secondly, when we consume protein straight after exercise, the effects of insulin and the improved ability to store glycogen, it remains higher for longer. So as you have finished exercise, you will be very insulin tolerant. So what's happening is the moment you finish exercise, the body wants to replenish its lost glycogen. And the way that it's going to do that is it's going to keep its insulin levels high. And so you are going to be able to consume high GI and be able to store that glycogen in the body better. When you consume protein at the same time, those insulin benefits remain higher for longer. And I don't think I've seen anyone with that answer, which is a good answer to put down yet. Now this is repeated sprints. Those sprints are lasting 5 or 6 seconds or so. Therefore, we know that it's anaerobic, it's a sprint, and it's short duration, less than 10 seconds. So it's ATP-PC. The number one fatiguing factor is a loss of phosphate creatine or depletion of phosphate creatine fuels, however you want to write that, but mention phosphate creatine. Explain how the factor changes energy system interplay. It's 4 marks worth. You want to mention that there is a loss of phosphate creatine. Because of that, the body is unable to sustain high intensity phosphate creatine, restoring ATP. So you end up in anaerobic glycolysis system. You also want to mention the fact that the anaerobic glycolysis system is the next fastest energy system, and that is why the body will choose that one. But you do want to mention the fact that it is a slower producer of ATP, energy for ATP than ATP-PC system. Okay. You can also mention the fact that that energy system, anaerobic glycolysis, has fatiguing byproducts that the ATP-PC system does not. Next one round, active recovery is detrimental, and detrimental, it was a word that students struggled with last year. It means lower or less. So we're talking about a detrimental performance. We're actually talking about why an active recovery in between each of these sprints would be worse. And it goes back to that simple fact that it is a slower replenishment of phosphate creatine stores when you're active compared to passive. Please don't write that there would be no replenishment of phosphate creatine stores, because there still will be, but it's at a very slow and low rate. Okay, so it's just a much slower and lower rate of replenishing PC if we're active. Now, these caused a lot of issues for students last year, this true-false style of question. All right, so let's have a look at them. During the final sprint to the finish line of the Tour de France cycling, after 200 plus kilometers, anaerobic glycolysis provides most of the energy for ATP at the end. That is incorrect. Because of the word most, you are still actually aerobically dominant, but you would have an increased contribution from the anaerobic glycolysis system. Okay. Next one down. Proteins should only be consumed by athletes who have experienced significant muscle breakdown. That is incorrect, and that's what we talked about before with the benefits to do with insulin. Inorganic phosphate limits the ability for the ATP-PC system to contribute to muscular contractions. Well, inorganic phosphate limits the ability for all energy systems, so that is true. The aerobic energy system must wait for the 2 anaerobic systems. That is completely false. Right now, I am sitting on a couch. If I stand up, I don't need to wait and go through ATP-PC and anaerobic glycolysis. I would stay aerobically dominant but have a higher contribution from different energy systems. So that one is false. Passive recovery is recommended for people who use ATP-PC system predominant. That is true, and we've talked about why already. During an active recovery, the pumping action created by the muscles assists in the oxidation of hydrogen ions. That is false and was quite contentious last year because the muscle pump is helping remove blood and waste from the muscles. It is not helping with getting oxygen down to the muscles. So therefore, that is not a correct statement. So false for that last question. Moving on to the last page, and we'll wrap this video up. We're talking about two athletes, Karani James and Mo Farah, a 400-meter athlete and a 10-kilometer athlete. What is their predominant energy system? Firstly, anaerobic for a 400, and secondly, aerobic for the 10,000 meters. It says here, describe the physiological mechanism that is used to prevent fatigue and elevated core temperature in the 10K. You need to mention thermoregulation here and the fact that that is the body's ability to try and stay within its right temperature range, and that keeps you in homeostasis, so the body functioning regularly. And the thing that the body does is it sweats. I should have written that out, but I forgot to write that out. But you need to mention sweating in this answer. So the two key words to come up in that answer there is the body going through thermoregulation and the body using sweating as a mechanism, which is the water coming out of the plasma of the blood as it's redirected to the blood, to the skin rather than the working muscles. And that sweat allows that cool to evaporate off our skin and cool us down. Now, I'm hoping that that was really helpful for you. You should have your SAC out in front of you, and as I'm going through this, having a look at what you got right and what you got wrong and rewriting some of these things. Video went a little longer than I thought, but I wanted to explain the reasons as to why, because we would have spent time in class doing that, probably 40 minutes or so. So hopefully that's given you some insight, and I'll come back to you with the next video, which is all going to be about the fitness components for Unit 4. See you soon.